One of these photos was shot with a camera lens that costs over $2,000. The other was shot with a camera lens that costs under $200. But they look so similar. So what's the catch? Well, recently I made a video about this camera lens, which is the Canon RF 50mm 1.2 L series prime lens, which led a lot of you to have questions about this guy, which is the Canon RF 50mm 1.8 STM lens, or what's commonly referred to as the Nifty 50. There's a pretty big price difference between both of these lenses, so in this video, we're gonna look at some photo samples to see if you can guess which one was shot on the expensive lens and which one was shot on the much cheaper lens. But I also wanna get to the bottom of whether or not it's needed to spend to potentially $3,000 on an L series prime lens when you have all of these cheaper, less expensive options available. Right off the bat, both of these lenses are native Canon RF lenses, which means they're made by Canon, they're first-party lenses, because a lot of the times you can get third-party lenses made by other people, especially this Nifty 50. There are quite a lot of these out there, and some of them aren't so great. My recommendation would be, if you are in this price range and looking at a lens like this, to go for this. Don't go with one of those $50, $60 cheap options. It's gonna be much more worth your investment and the quality investment into your photos to go with something like this. But I will link all the options for all these lenses down in the description below, so you can check them out for yourself and see what they cost in the area of the world that you live in. Both of these lenses have autofocus, which is great because manual focus is very challenging. Both of them are also 50mm lenses, which might be the obvious thing to state, but there are actually slight differences between these two lenses, which I'll talk about in a bit. But neither of these lenses have image stabilization, which may or may not be a deal breaker depending on what it is you're shooting. For photography, for most likely the type of stuff that you're doing, it really shouldn't be a deal breaker. So here's our first set of photos. I'll give you a second to see if you can figure out which one was shot on the $2,000 lens. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. On the 51.2, I actually shot that photo at f1.4 because that lens allows in so much light. I was actually hitting my maximum shutter speed and had to step it down. If you guessed that the left image was the $2,000 lens, you would be correct. It's actually really hard to tell when your subject is this far away, but one of the giveaways would be the tree that's in the foreground that's just a little bit blurrier and a little bit more out of focus than the photo shot with the $200 lens. I'll give you a second chance with this photo to see if you can spot the difference. Like the last photo, I also shot the 50mm 1.2 at f.4. Now let's zoom in a little bit to see if you can spot the big difference. I will say profile corrections have been applied to both of these lenses, but in this case, it's the image on the right side that was shot with the $2,000 lens, the image on the left with the $200 lens. This matchup should be a little bit more obvious, especially if you're an experienced photographer, because there is one key giveaway inside this photo. I'll give you a second. And it's the photo on the left that is the $2,000 lens. The big giveaway, of course, is the fact that we have way more out of focus bokeh in the background. That's that blurry area that you get because you're able to step down from a 1.8 all the way to 1.2 with the more expensive lens. Now, if you were paying attention to the last two photos, you've probably already guessed which one of these was shot on the $2,000 lens. And it's the image on the right. That's the one that was shot with the 50mm f1.2. So all the photos that you've seen have been edited with my presets, and I just threw them on quickly so you didn't have to look at a boring, unsaturated raw photo. But that also means profile corrections were applied to these images to remove things like vignetting and distortion and chromatic aberration so that it was harder for you to guess the differences between two of these lenses. But let's take a look at some unedited, uncorrected photos to really see what's going on with these two lenses. Now, I mentioned both of these camera lenses are 50 millimeters, but you'll notice that the 51.8, so our cheaper $200 lens, is just ever so slightly wider, and because the way the optics work and the placement on the lens, it's nearly impossible to have these line up exactly. The way I shot these test samples was to have my camera locked off on a tripod. Both of the lenses were in manual mode so that there was no refocusing in between shots, and then I used aperture priority, where the only thing I was changing was the aperture setting, and then the camera automatically adjusted the shutter to maintain the same exposure in between shots. Now, on the left here, we have the cheaper 1.8 lens, and one thing I do notice is that there is a little bit more vignetting, which I feel like you can notice around the edges up here and around the bottom down here. And I'm also noticing a slight magenta shift in the 51.8, so in our cheaper lens. The same thing that we saw earlier, where the quality of the bokeh was nicer on the 1.2, we're also seeing here. So I set up one of my little aperture lights in the background, and even though they're both shot at 1.8, you will notice that it's definitely a lot smoother looking on the higher quality L series lens. At 100% at the center of the frame, it's really hard to notice a difference between these two lenses. Maybe the guy on the left, which is the 51.8, is a little bit softer. Like, those blacks look a little bit more washed out. Now keep in mind, I didn't adjust exposure. I'm not applying any presets. This is how they look straight out of camera. And if I go to the text on the left side, where it starts to fall off, like right here, you can see on the 1.2, the L series lens, it's in focus. We got nice contrast. We do have a little bit of chromatic aberration. And then on the left lens, the cheaper lens, you do notice that it's just softer overall. Even though it should be in focus around this point, I guess there's like slight differences where you have warping and distortion closer to the edges of the frame. So it's gonna be nice and sharp at the center of the frame, and then as you get to the edges, you're not gonna get as much sharpness. And we see that same thing repeated when you look at the hairs of the dead cat. Like, to me, the bokeh on the 1.2 looks a lot more pleasing. The hairs look a lot more sharp. Like, this area in particular looks way smoother on the L series lens. Given the fact that there is like a massive 10 times price difference, the 1.8 STM lens is actually holding up pretty well. The cheaper lens also has more chromatic aberration in those areas of high contrast. Like, on the image on the left, you can see how there's more green fringing. Like, we still have a little bit of it on the L series lens, which isn't uncommon when you're all the way down shooting at 1.2 or 1.4. Like, you're still gonna get some chromatic aberration, but if we actually go to that image that we were looking at earlier, if you zoom into this image, which we looked at the beginning, now you can see what we couldn't see before. We do have chromatic aberration in those areas of high contrast, but we had to zoom in all the way to 100% to see it. Are you gonna see it if you post this photo on Instagram? Probably not. I found with both of these lenses that if you step up from the lowest aperture setting with the more expensive f1.2, if you step that up to f2, I find a lot of that chromatic aberration starts to disappear. With the f1.8, if you step that up to f2.8, that's when I find a lot of that really severe chromatic aberration starts to go away. But if you want to use your lenses at their lowest aperture setting, you can actually go in to Lightroom, and there's something called lens corrections. And if I enable profile corrections, you can see how it just removed that vignette from around the edge of the photo. Now I'll zoom in to 300% here. And if I say remove chromatic aberration, and then I go over to the manual controls because I need to tell it what color we're removing, and I grab this little color picker and I just grab right over the green. This is something that you can apply to the photos on any of the lenses that you shoot with if you are noticing really serious chromatic aberration. On paper, it doesn't sound like a lot, but the difference between shooting at 1.8 and 1.2 is actually one full stop of light. So let's say you've maxed out your camera settings. You're shooting at 6400 ISO, f1.8, and the photos are looking a little bit noisy because maybe you're shooting in a low light scenario. If you now drop from 1.8 to f1.2, that is one full stop of light. That means you could go from shooting at 6400 ISO to 3200 ISO, which for a lot of photographers is an absolute game changer. With these differences in mind, I'm curious to hear from you. Is 1.2 enough to justify spending $2,000 plus on a lens? Or will the type of photography that you're shooting be enough to shoot on the nifty 50 f1.8? Let me know down in the description below. And if you like this video, there's a pretty good chance you'll probably also enjoy this video here. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe and do all those other things that you're supposed to. And until the next one, go shoot photos.